Well, greetings, Northway family. It's good to be with you all again. Well, it's been a while, though. I've missed you and missed connecting with various ones, different places, but it's always an honor to be able to share the word with you, and it's a little humbling, I have to say. If you heard Pastor Freedom last week, was that not an awesome job from a guy who's been through so much? And I was blown away by that. And it's humbling to know that God's favor rests upon those that He's called into leadership here in our church and all the campuses. So much is happening, you can't begin to take it all in. But as you all know, if you come regularly, the Lord's moving. You just have to be willing to be moved. And that's what we're going to look at today. I've chosen a passage in Mark's Gospel that's consistent with our series from the Lake of Gennesaret or the Sea of Galilee. And I don't know why I do this, but of all the stories I could have chosen, I selected the one that has 3 significant miracles. I mean, life-changing encounters that Jesus has with people who have incredible needs. Now, I thought, why do I pick up these more controversial passages? I mean, I don't preach that much, so why don't I just play it safe? Talk about fishing in the Lake of Gennesaret or something like that. No, I guess I do it for this reason. I read these stories and I see our Savior, powerful, able to, with a word, bring healing or deliverance or change or restoration into a person's life. And I read the Bible and it says in Hebrews 13:8 that Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So He hasn't changed, but I'll be very candid and say to us all, I don't think we see much of that kind of activity in the church in America, period. And only in remote parts of the world do we still see those kinds of really miraculous, life-changing, inexplicable, supernatural kinds of intervention. But I'm drawn to it for the reason that I just said. Jesus hasn't changed, so I expect that somehow we can either see our faith grow or maybe our understanding become realigned with what God says. Because how many of you, even as I share this word, really would want to see God move in your life in some particular way that maybe not everyone knows about? And if you don't have a particular need, you know somebody who does. We live in a very needy world, don't we? But one of the things that I see all around is an increasing sort of propensity for believers, people who call themselves Christ followers, and this is the first blank in your outline, to become spiritually comfortable. This is a real danger, friends. I mean, it's something that all of us need to maybe ask the questions as we listen through today's message and maybe in your quiet time this week and time with your group, friends that you share with. Because the spiritually comfortable person is somebody who, they find themselves in a good place. They're sort of balanced. They have a little of this and some of that, and they're not afraid to try a few things. But you know what? Don't ask me to go out there in that area which is really beyond where I'm really, safe. Don't ask me to extend. I'm okay in sharing about Christ with my parents, but don't send me to the neighbor next door because they might not get it, and I don't want to have them, as an enemy for the rest of my days. That kind of thing. Well, whether we like it or not, that spiritual comfort zone is very deceptive. And here's why do we go there? Because it's comfortable and we like that. It doesn't stress us out, and we have enough things in our life that's already doing that, and we're right. If you're in that comfort zone, you think you're right, or you wouldn't be there, and you're just waiting for the rest of the church to come around and see the world as you do. And one day they'll be enlightened too and join in your spiritual comfort, and we'll all go happily into heaven. Well, unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the case, does it? Let's take a look here at just two of the three characters we're going to look at real carefully. And I'm going to invite you to see with me how becoming uncomfortable, next blank in your outline, is sometimes necessary in order for us to see change and power in our life. So let's look at these two characters. They both met Jesus around the lake. And, oh, by the way, before we head there, I don't know if the other guys, I can't remember if this has happened or not, but have they shown you a photograph of the Lake of Gennesaret, the Sea of Galilee? Take a quick look at this. I've seen this myself a couple of times, friends. And I remember telling Carol when we were on our trip to the Holy Land, I'm going to tell you, here's a little hint. It's as beautiful as that picture looks. I mean, that's an untouched photo. The climate is sort of moderate. I said, Jesus was no dummy. I mean, he didn't go to like Pittsburgh or Detroit or Boston. I mean, that's a beautiful place, and that's where he spent most of his life in ministry. But that's the tip of the Sea of Galilee, Lake of Gennesaret, and that's what it looks like. It's kind of gentle hills, and then on the other side you can see the rolling terrain. Beautiful place. That's the area that we're looking at. All right, let's pick this up. And this story is pretty powerful. And I want to speak first of all to those with what I'm going to call critical need. I want to write that down. A critical need. Let's read about it. It says this in verse 21, under number 1 in your outline. Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, and a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Got the picture? Let me pause there. Why? All right. This is where I had to make some choices. I made a choice to not talk about the first 20 verses of Mark 5, because that's where Jesus, when he was on the other side of the lake, had an encounter with a man who was possessed by demons. And I know that's immediately like, uh-oh. I mean, that's going into the 40-foot deep range of uncomfortability, right? So we're not going to talk a lot about that, except that with the word, Jesus released a couple thousand demons from this man into a herd of pigs, who then ran off one of those cliffs that you saw in the picture and drowned in the lake. Now, the farmers and the people that owned those pigs told their friends, and they saw the pigs bobbing dead in water, and it was not a good scene. You know what? They came to Jesus, and though the man sat next to him, a man they had not been able to help, the Bible says he was in chains. He could break chains off. He was not in his right mind. And there he was, seated next to Jesus in his right mind and fully delivered. That scared the people so much that they said, would you please leave our territory? That's too much power for us. But that word of this miraculous deliverance had already gotten around this lake to the other side, so that when Jesus stepped off the boat, it says, I think the word there is large crowd. A more accurate translation of the Greek word there is vast. It's thousands of people have already gathered to see, catch a glimpse of this man who freed the demoniac of Gennesaret. And they see Jesus as he steps out of the boat. All right, and here's what happens. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus, and friends, I just mentioned this, name another person that Jesus healed or touched that he named. Oh, well, I'll go way off on that, but it's interesting. It's one of the few times that he mentions the name of the person that he's going to be ministering to. It's Jairus, who, by the way, was a synagogue leader. And what does that tell us about this man? Well, this is a man of significant influence in his community. He's a man of good education, no doubt. Being a leader of the synagogue meant that he was probably pretty well off back then, because they had access to resources. So this powerful man kind of represents one whole class of people. And you'll see in a moment how that differs from the other person that he encounters in this side of the lake. Look what this powerful man says. He came, and when he saw Jesus, notice what happens. He fell at his feet. Friends, you have to understand, in religious code, that was a no-no. This dignified, highly recognized, highly respected leader of the Jewish synagogue falls at the feet of the one who the Jewish leaders have already nailed and pegged as a false prophet and a false Messiah. But when you have a critical need, you don't let boxes, titles, and names keep you away from Jesus. In fact, if you have a critical need, you'll do anything to see Jesus meet that need. So letter A, Jairus breaks out of a religious comfort zone and falls at the feet of Jesus. And I want to just pause there, because as I was preparing the message, the Holy Spirit just strongly communicated to my heart that there are several of us hearing the message today for whom that's the very specific block that you have in your spirit to receiving anything from God. It's a religious block. I have people who frequently say, I've been a pretty good person. I've gone to church all my life. How many know going to church all your life can be a good thing? How many know it can be one of the worst things that ever happened to you, right? Because maybe church was oppressive or boring or whatever. So being religious doesn't mean anything. What God is after is not a religion, friends. He's after a relationship. And Jairus took this critical need and allowed it to break that box of religion that he'd been locked up in and to reach out to Jesus. And notice his words. He pleaded earnestly with him. He said, "My little daughter is dying." If you have that on your outline, I'd underline that. That defines a critical need. Any of us who are parents would understand immediately. If one of our younger, any of our children, but if a young child especially is dying. And so he says, "Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." Sometimes, you see, God will allow something critical like this to happen in our lives. He doesn't cause it. He just allows it for the purpose of getting us out of our comfort zone. I am thinking right now of a man that's still in our church. About 7 years ago, a really bright young man. He had a really solid position with a well-known corporation downtown. And one day, unexpectedly, he got a pink slip and was sent off, and that was it. And he told me at the time it was no big deal. He already had his resume prepped, and he just made a few changes. And he was all highly accomplished already. Now he had some experience, and he'd pick up another job. Well, it just so happened that the job that he lost and the position he was in the field he was in was one of those that was getting squeezed in what's been called the Great Recession. And for 3 years, I watched this young man with, I think, 4 kids go on scores, maybe 100 interviews. Nothing. And how many of you know that gets depressing after a while? I mean, how many times can you hear somebody, no, thank you, don't need you, not good enough, don't whatever. And I watched him do everything and anything just to get by. Menial jobs. I mean, washing cars, things like that. After 3 years, that's a long time, I walked up to him one day and I said, "Any change?" "Oh," he said, "you haven't heard?" I said, "No." He said, "I just landed a dream job at a higher salary and with more benefits and opportunity for growth and enlargement than I've ever had." He said, "Just so thrilled about this opportunity." He said, but listen, Pastor Jay, I am thankful for what happened to me in the past 3 years, because God got my attention, and my view of myself, my relationship with Him, with others, and with the world around me has been radically changed. And he said, I don't think that would have happened if I'd stayed on the fast track of corporate success. Now, I'm not saying or wishing that on anybody, but I say to the credit of that young man, he allowed God to use it for good in his life. And now he's serving the Lord in a position with significant benefits. Listen, God will always restore what the locusts have eaten if you just trust and hang on and believe him. That was about 7 years ago, and then, so he's been doing this now about 3 or 4 years. Now, let's push pause with this critical need, okay? Just push pause on your little mental recorder. Because I want to jump. Something happens here. Take your outline and turn it over. A woman presses up through the crowd. She's the second character. A woman with no apparent means of support, no money, and worst of all, she suffered from what is described as a issue or blood or bleeding disorder. And by the way, this was not menstrual or anything to do with that. This was an ongoing, listen, she'd been suffering with this internal bleeding for 12 years. Everyone say 12. 12 years. And let's read about it. A woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. I'm on verse 26 in the back. She suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and spent all she had. I want to pause there and say, if you're a doctor, it didn't say she suffered under the care by the doctor. I mean, don't paint yourself into that box. In other words, she was suffering and they were trying to help her, but to no avail. Okay? Instead of getting better, she grew worse. What is a chronic situation like? This is a chronic need. A chronic need, number 2. A chronic need is like this. It's something that you suffer. And by the way, it may be physical, but it may be relational. It may be vocational. It may be something to do with your behaviors. It could be an addiction. It could be a behavioral trap that you're in. Gambling, you make it up, whatever it is. But it's chronic. You suffer because you know it's not right or good for you. The people who try to help you are getting nowhere. Many times you spend all your resources trying to find help, trying to get out of this thing. Am I right? I mean, if it's chronic and it's suffering, causing suffering, you spend whatever you have to. It sometimes becomes so depressing that it paralyzes you from making decisions. There's the next 2 blanks in your outline. It's depressing and keeps you. Now, I think I've probably described the situation of maybe 20% of the people listening to me today. Maybe more. There's an area of your life where you're in chronic need. It may be any of the ones I mentioned, or maybe I didn't mention it, but you know that I'm talking to you right now. Maybe you're in a broken marriage and that thing just keeps tearing you down. You want out of it so badly. If I could be just a bit personal right now, this is where I identify. And I'm going to spare you all the details of this, but those of you that have been around here for a while know that I've had a rather significant back problem for a long time. 23 years ago, I first diagnosed with it. 19 years ago, I had my first major surgery. And the people of this church have been wonderful and supportive and prayerful, and I've managed to stay along fairly well. And a couple months ago, interestingly enough, in a prayer service, I did something with my back that just, it did not tolerate. And so for the last couple of months, I've been on, another level that I didn't know really one could exist very long yet. But it's been through the prayers of my family and those of you, the church family that know us, supporting me. And I'm just asking the question now, Lord, what am I supposed to do next? I know this is not, but I'm also saying, Lord, what do I need to learn? What's in this? I mean, there's more than physical things happening right now. And so, thank you for praying. Thank you for caring. This woman on your outline that we're talking about, we're given some insight into her thought processes. Let's look and see what she said. Verse 27, when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. What is she demonstrating there? Faith, right? I mean, I believe that if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Please note that just as with Jairus, the synagogue leader, this woman also believes that Jesus will do what they need to have done. And her faith is activated. Two very different kinds of people, an accomplished, well-regarded, highly influential businessman and synagogue leader, and an impoverished, broken, probably spiritually and personally segregated from the rest of the community because of her bleeding disorder. They both come to Jesus with the common gift of faith, to believe him, to heal them from their need. Friends, Jesus is looking on your outline for living faith. He's searching for it. I love the response here. Notice this. Verse 29, immediately her bleeding stopped. When? Immediately. I mean, it didn't take a long time. That's something, and I just want to make two little observations about this that you may or may not fully embrace. But number one, in my experience, most healings that take place are really gradual. I can probably count on one hand, maybe, the number of times I've seen something really substantial happen immediately. I have seen substantial things, healing of cancer and other things, but they've been more gradual. So it's unusual in that regard. And second, what we receive from Jesus often depends on how we touch him. Because remember, a lot of people were bumping into him. The crowd was jostling along. In fact, the disciples, I think they turned, well, let's see what happened. Verse 30, at once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. How would you like to be so tuned into the Holy Spirit that you knew when some of your power had been tapped into? That's not where I live, but that's where Jesus lived. And notice what he does. He turned around in the crowd and asked, who touched my clothes? And his disciples said, well, you see the people crowding against you, and yet you can ask who touched me? Verse 32, but Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Friends, stay with me on this. Did Jesus know who touched him? Of course. Little note to self here. Anytime Jesus asks a question, it's not because he needs the answer. You got that? Never thought of that. Yeah. He knows everything. So he could have said, see you back there with the blue sweater. You're the one. Get on up here. Whatever. He knew. He always asks the question because he's got something more to reveal, something greater to engage, something more powerful to open up in your life. Remember that. In this case, Jesus wanted to fully bless this woman and help her understand that he wasn't just walking around as some miracle worker that was going through town and as part of the circus. He wanted her to know that the one whom she had drawn power from for healing in her body loved her as a person and blessed her with shalom, which in the Hebrew means wholeness, fullness of life, even salvation. Same root word. Jesus wanted her to know that the one who healed her loved her. That's why he asked, who touched me? And notice when she fell at his feet, she was fearful that he was going to maybe do something. No. Jesus just blessed her and said, woman or daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your bleeding. Friends, I love the fact that Jesus cares so much about us that even when Miraculous, wonderful things happen. He says, you know what? That's not the end. The end of it really isn't that I receive a miracle. The end is that I know him better and I'm more prepared to walk with him into heaven. He wants you to know him as Savior and Lord. And by the way, he even says in John 10:38, if you don't believe me for what I say, believe for the miracles that I am who I said I am. I am the Messiah, the Son of God. Now, let's switch back, shall we, to the critical need again. Turn your outline back over. And here's what it says. In the middle of this sort of amazing moment when the crowd stopped and the woman came and was pretty full of drama and so on, suddenly, look at this. Verse 35, while Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. Your daughter is dead, they said. Why bother the teacher anymore? And frankly, I think in that language, they're revealing a little bit of disdain for the whole process. But nonetheless, what's Jairus' response? If that had been you, and you were on your way with Jesus, who you knew could heal, and now because of this woman and her need, my daughter's now dead. That woman just took my blessing. I could think of several different reactions that probably would have been justified. But I love the fact that we don't have to know it, because here's what happens. Look what Jesus does. It says this. Verse 36, overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, that's Jairus, don't be afraid, just believe. Everyone say that. Don't be afraid, just believe. Now, how about the rest of us? Don't be afraid, just believe. Friends, the Lord knows that when we hear difficult news, our first reaction, our natural reaction is to fear. Fear is the opposite of faith. That verse right there, I would suggest that would be a great verse to just memorize and have available every time you hear some news. Don't be afraid. Just believe. You get a phone call that your little son was in a biking accident and they're rushing him to the hospital. Don't be afraid. Just believe. The president wants you in his office tomorrow. Doesn't look good. Sales are down. Jobs are gone. Don't be afraid. Just believe. I would love to see more men and women in this church have their response to difficult news not be, oh, woe is me, but don't be afraid. Just believe. And choose to act in your faith. And it's not always easy. I remember an incident that happened some years ago now. Carol and I had sort of a family tradition that she and I went out on Sunday evening. That was our date night after a long weekend of ministry. And our kids were in their teen years at that point. And we were heading home, heading up Babcock Boulevard out of North Park, and we got stopped just at the bottom of the hill going out of from the north area. You kind of know where I'm talking about, but if not, less than 2 miles from my house, there was a police officer there, and he would close the road. And he said, officer, we live just about 1.5 miles up the road. He said, well, there was a serious accident up there. We're not letting traffic up right now. I said, well, that's where we live. And he said, well, all right, go up and just be really careful. And we knew that our son had gone to student ministry that night. And we knew that he had a ride home. And as we drove the car up the road, closer and closer to our house, wouldn't you know that 3 or 4 ambulances, a couple of fire trucks, I don't know how many police cars were all right there at the driveway of our home. Because the van that had carried my son home had just backed into the road, and a big pickup called a dually, dual axle pickup, smashed that van, hit it right in the middle and flipped it on its side. And we looked with a bit of horror, but don't be afraid. Just believe. Less than a minute later, our son came, said, I'm fine. They had just let me out of the van. Well, we're thankful, but now what about who's left in the van? And he said, and I've been up there, and it appears that everyone's okay. Turns out that there were no critical injuries. Thankfully, amazingly, when you saw the situation. See, you just never know. You might go through 10 years with nothing really significant ever happens in your life. But when it does, don't be afraid. Just believe. Because it's an opportunity to grow, to see your faith extend. So let's see here. Let's end this story with this. What happens? Verse 37, he did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jairus, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. That's what you see in the Middle East. It's sort of the way that they do their mourning. They just wail and cry out. It's very tumultuous. And Jesus says in verse 39, the child's not dead, but asleep. Now, he knows that she's dead, but he just wants to kind of get them off the case. Verse 40, but they laughed at him. Note to self, don't ever laugh at Jesus. At him. You can laugh with him about it, but never at him. Disrespectful. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the 3 disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. Let me pause there and say, friends, if it mattered to Jesus that he be surrounded by people of faith, how many of you would agree with me that maybe we ought to take a little note of who we surround ourselves with? Because if you're surrounding yourself with people who don't believe or have no interest in faith, or worse, violently disagree, you're likely to have a battle that you can't win. And so we do well not to isolate ourselves from people that have needs or might believe differently, but when critical situations arise, get those people around you. That's when having that group, that band of brothers or sisters, that's when having a home group, that's when this whole ministry was born and birthed on the idea of community. That's when you want to have community around you. Believe in God with you, that he's going to come through. Well, take a look. Let's just read it for ourselves. Verse 41, he took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. I love that. Just no messing around. I say to you, get up. And look at verse 42. Immediately, there it is again. The girl stood up and began to walk around, for she was 12 years old. And at this, the few that were there, were completely astonished. One translation says they were beside themselves with joy. Hallelujah. And notice this. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this. Well, wait a minute. The woman that he healed, he said, hey, come on up and show yourself for, let everyone know. But not this time. And there's not a real quick, easy answer for this, but here's what I'm going to submit to you. It was because this was a literal resurrection. This was still early in Jesus' ministry. And it was not time for him to try to explain the resurrection of another until he explained to them the resurrection of himself. There was one other person that Jesus raised from the dead that we know of. What was his name? Lazarus, right. Excellent. But by that point, it was near the end of Jesus' ministry, and he was preparing for his own resurrection. So that's why that command is there. So, how do we want to close this? I love these stories. I just was hitting the high part. If you go in, I literally spent a couple of weeks just pulling through this and seeing the sensitivity, the power, the grace, the favor. But mostly, I cannot read this, friends, and stay spiritually comfortable. I read this and I just hunger, Lord, somehow show me how to let faith ignite in my life. Hey, new church campuses, new church planters that might be listening throughout. You want to draw a large crowd? Tap into the miracle working power of God. Every place where God's power is genuinely authentically being revealed, people will show up. They are still desperate to be touched by the Lord. So I'm going to invite you to stand, and the campus pastors will come up and stand with your congregations, please, and we're going to pray together. Let's stand.